Evening, everyone, and thanks for the for the sound check. I did actually need the sound check notice, but people are still going to be mad with me because I think I've messed up the monetization settings. Never mind. But what I thought I'd to discuss today is some of the weird ways in which some Conservatives, including Conservative MPs, more important, but also some Conservative commentators, the Conservative collective, commentators, MPs, Tory media, are presenting or trying to rewrite history, basically trying to present certain things. It's quite funny because I've literally just come across a tweet from RMT, which is the Rail and Maritime, but it's the union basically for a lot of railway workers, and it's and what the Tories are trying at the moment is they're trying this line whereby they're saying, oh, they're choosing their union mates over pensioners. They're taking this money like the winter fuel allowance and they're giving it to their union mates. And first of all, they're not giving it to any union mates. They're giving it to workers, many of whom are in a union. But, when they talk about, oh, they're doing it because the unions fund the Labour Party. And it's like, okay, yeah. Several unions do indeed fund the Labour Party. Who funds the unions? Who pays for the unions? Would it be ordinary people paying their union subs? I think it's ordinary people paying their union subs, not billionaires with offshore bank accounts. Which is why one of the big things in the news, well, it was yesterday really, but people are catching up with it today, is the register of members' financial interests has been published, which means people are going through various MPs looking at what money they've made in various places and who's donated. The donations are the most important thing, really, because there's supposed to be proper acknowledgement of donations made. So that's usually the more interesting part of the financial interest. But, it comes out, the news says, oh, Nigel Farage, the highest paid MP. No, he ain't. Only according to those records, he's not the highest paid MP. There are MPs that make more money than he does, including his deputy, Richard Tice. But they don't declare it because their money is, where is it? Offshore funds. So they don't have to declare it. Isn't that good? Don't have to pay tax either. Isn't that good? So there we go. But there was other things as well. Like one of the main ones I would say where they're trying to rewrite history is actually trying to say that the economy is in great shape because we had this 0.6% growth, and it's like, and what they're doing, first of all, like one of the lines that keeps coming through is they keep saying things like, oh, we've got the highest growth in the G7, highest growth of the G7, our economy is doing great. And I keep trying to explain, first of all, you're just picking out snapshots. I'm going to show how the con works in a minute. But then they'll say things like, I thought we were supposed to have the second worst GDP growth in the G7 next to Germany. Where's this then? Well, let me show you then. There it is. There you go. That's us in second to last place in the G7. It's even got the Eurozone on there, helpfully, because they always try and throw that one in as well. And what this is, because this isn't a snapshot, this is compared with the end of 2019. So this is compared to the pre-pandemic, but in our case, we could also say the pre-Brexit period. That's where it is. We have the second lowest growth. And why does Germany have the lowest growth? Oh, Germany's in the EU. How come that's knackered as well? Because they were very silly in promoting Nord Stream 1 and 2, which has, as a lot of people said for many years, gone and bitten them in the arse. So Germany did a stupid thing as well. We did a stupid thing. Theirs has been more costly in the short term in terms of growth. But that's the reality of the situation. You don't just pick out a snapshot. And what they do here is, and this is how it works. If I put up another little chart, now this is an older one, but the format is particularly useful for showing it. So obviously this only goes up to quarter 3 2022. It doesn't matter what the year range is, just to show you how it works. Because if you look at the bottom where it's got United Kingdom, stuff like that, what happens is if we run along from Q4 2020, so what happens is they'll look at Q4 2020 and they'll go, it's a bit middling there, we'll sort of ignore that. Then Q1 in 2021, they go, oh, it's negative, no, we'll ignore that as well. Then along comes Q2. Obviously, if your economy hasn't been growing too well, at some point, because remember, these percentages, they're not comparing with other countries, they're just comparing with your own economy. If your economy shrinks a bit and then it grows a bit, well, the percentage growth looks really good compared with the ones that were just growing slowly over a longer period of time. So what happens is Q2 2021, all of a sudden you've got 6.5% growth. You go, that's marvelous. Then it's splashed all over the place. It's splashed everywhere, all over the Tory media. The right-wing commentators are throwing it everywhere. Look at this is fantastic. This is proper growth. Then next one doesn't look so good. They ignore it a bit. They go quiet. You know, and they wait for another time when it looks really good. That's what they do, and they do it every single time. And it's not just the mainstream media. As I say, the right-wing commentators do it. I mean, left-wing commentators will do it, I suppose, with Labour. I mean, part of it is political spin to an extent. But when the media do it, then they're doing the public a disservice. And that's how the con works, ultimately. That is how it works. And here's another one. I saw this one today. I did it from my shorts, so some of you may have seen it. It's tragically hilarious. So Tim Montgomery, for those who don't know, he's a commentator. He's not an MP, but he's a very influential commentator. He's one of the people that set up Conservative Home, which is like their version of Labour List. It's a website designed for Conservative Party members. It's taken very seriously by Conservative MPs and Conservative Party members for whom they are their target audience. A lot of good stuff on it. They get lots of people with a broad range of conservative views to write for them. They don't just amplify the nut jobs. They give all conservative-minded people have a platform on it. So it's a pretty good site for if you are right wing. But here he goes into full tribalism mode. So he points out a headline. This headline is in the Telegraph. It's silent prayer outside abortion clinics faces ban by Home Office, right? So he says this censorious direction of this government is increasingly clear and increasingly worrying. And what is he trying to say? So, this Labour government have come in, they're all authoritarian, they're coming with the jackboots and everything. It's absolutely disgraceful. What are they doing? They're banning silent prayer, blah, blah, blah. And it doesn't matter whether you agree that this is a good thing or not. I don't know. I don't care. Any sort of peaceful protest is peaceful protest, isn't it? As long as you're not blocking access to anything, or intimidating people. But here's the thing. He's describing this as the current government, so the Labour government, introducing this thing. Now, the same article, I'm going to show actually two images at once here. So underneath is a line, a paragraph indeed, quite a small one though, from that very article. Now let's have a read of it. It says, MPs voted for legislation last year which would ban protests, including silent prayer, within a buffer zone of 150 metres of a clinic or hospital providing abortion services, but it has not yet come into force. So what the article is actually saying is that this law was passed last year. Who was in power last year? Oh, it was the Conservatives. It was, and more than that, it was an amendment to the Public Order Act, which was powered through by Conservatives. And people may recall these amendments, including this one, were pushed through this was when Priti Patel was still the Home Secretary. So although it was passed last year, it started to go through Parliament the year before. Steady on, Phil, 3 images in total. I'm sure you can cope. I'm sure. I attract people with brains, I hope. And so she, if you recall, and I think this was one of them, put it through at the House of Lords stage, which meant that MPs weren't allowed to debate on it or vote for it. So actually, this is entirely on the Conservatives. Entirely on the Conservatives. And what I've done underneath, the third image underneath, is from an article from the Telegraph at the time the Conservatives were proposing it. And you can, well, you can't probably, unless you've got it on like HD television or something, you might not see the date. But the date on there is the 15th of October 2022, 6 p.m. if you're interested, right? So this is, but if you look at the tweet, you would think this is something the Labour government are doing. Whereas in actual fact, no, this is something the Conservative government did. It was being reported on as long ago as 2022. It was done in the shadiest way possible. No debate for MPs. So Labour MPs had nothing to do with it, nor did Lib Dem MPs, even Conservative MPs, apart from the members of the government who put it like Priti Patel is the one who rammed this through. So obviously it had cabinet approval. And it's and he's trying to suggest it's a Labour government thing, which again, it's just the the toxic tribalism of it. It's one thing to try and present things in the best possible light for the people you think should be in government and stuff like that, but it's another thing to actually just deliberately deceive people. And it is how they're these are just examples of how they're trying to rewrite history. This is an example of trying to say, oh, all these terrible laws are actually, it's Labour's fault. It's Labour's fault. It's like, no, you enacted them. Not him personally, but the Conservative government enacted these laws that they're now trying to blame on Labour. Same with the economy. I expected with the I'm going to put this one back up again. I expected with the economic news. So if the economy looks much stronger in a few years' time, I absolutely expect the political spin for the Conservatives to be, oh, you're only reaping the rewards of what we put into place, because that's just standard politics, right? And yet this is the reality, not a snapshot. Don't take a snapshot over a period of time. This is like the period of the last Parliament, so they can't complain. They can't say, oh, because arguably whenever you pick any period of time, you are to an extent cherry picking, aren't you? Where you decide to pick it up is to a certain extent subjective and will affect the overall results. But actually picking Q4 2019 is very useful for a number of reasons. It is pre-pandemic, so it is useful to see which governments rebuilt their economies after COVID. For us, it's also after leaving the EU, although the major economic hits came with leaving the single market at the beginning of 2021 and the customs union. But more importantly, Q4 2019 is when they won their majority. So it's perfectly reasonable to take it from Q4 2019, and indeed, this has been updated. So this actually represents the last Parliament. That represents 4.5 years. That represents 4.5 years. In fact, if it was updated 15th of August, it probably looks a little bit good for the UK because of that recent growth. But it represents 4.5 years, the period of time that the Conservatives had their majority, so could pass whatever they wanted. They can't complain about COVID or the war in Ukraine because all these other countries had that as well. Particularly when you look at, the Eurozone overall, which includes all and sundry in there, as well as France and Italy in there. They had that. Anyway, I'll go through some comments. I've been rambling on now. Adam there saying, unrelated, but now that Ukraine holds the Kursk region, well, for now, I don't think they're expecting to hold on. Well, they've said as much. They don't expect to hold on forever. It's very humiliating for Russia. The problem for Russia is that they haven't got anyone competent dealing with it. So it may well be that Ukraine hold on to it for longer than they might otherwise have expected. But anyway, should they hold a referendum on independence, that like the Russians did in Crimea, could make a nice buffer state for Ukrainian NATO membership? No. Obviously, I know it's just a joke. Ukraine are bending over backwards to make it clear that they are there complying fully with international law. They're at war. The word war is banned in Russia. You're not allowed to call it a war in Russia. Wonder why. So it's a special military operation. They've probably banned the word the term 3-day as well now, haven't they? But it is actually illegal to say, honestly, it's illegal to say the word war in Russia. Or at least like the western bits of Russia, like Moscow and places. But no, Ukraine are obviously bending over backwards to say, they're just complying with international law. Their stated reason for holding the region is Russia wants to negotiate. Great, we'll negotiate while we've got a bit of their land, just like they've got some of ours. How about that for a negotiating position? In reality, there's various other strategic reasons why they might be doing it. I'd be quite interested to see what they do as well. They do have to be careful. Obviously, I carry on reading a lot of things by military strategists. Ukraine do need to be careful. At some point, they would expect Russia to take it back. It's just, it may take them a while because Putin keeps putting boneheads in charge. He's pretty much sacked the top military brass as a result of this humiliation. But there we go. Anyway, on to some other, well, slightly related, I suppose. Derek there, Tories gave tax cuts to Russian oligarchs and who pays for the Tory party? Well, this was my point to Daniel Moylan. When he was saying this, he was saying, oh, they're just handing this money over to their union mates, the people who fund the Labour Party. And my answer to him was, and who funds the unions? Take your time. But then I also said, and then when you've worked that one out, why don't you have a think about who funds the Conservative Party in government? I had to say in government because right now not many people are funding the Conservative Party at all. They don't have many donations. They weren't getting many donations during the election campaign. It's actually quite funny in a way. They increased the cap for spending, political campaign spending, and then weren't able to make full use of it themselves because they weren't getting the donations in. They were buoyed up by that 10 million quid that they got in a will, in one of the Sainsbury's will. So they got this huge 10 million quid, like, what do you call it? It was literally an inheritance, but that windfall is the word I was looking for. And so they got this 10 million quid, but they didn't get very much after it. Because like, what's your reason for donating to a political party? There's various reasons. Let's go from the nice end to the not so nice end. So the first one is that you just support that party. You give them some donations. And that's fine, and that will always come, but that's relatively small amount. Yes, you may have, and the Conservatives are more likely to have very wealthy backers who genuinely support the Conservative Party, and they're not, they'll just donate for genuine reasons, and they'll chuck them a few million quid maybe. Then you've got the people who will do that, but they'll think to themselves, but it's just throwing money, it's money on nothing because you're going to lose quite badly. I mean, I remember in 2019, being perfectly honest, I shifted my donations to the Labour Party from just donating to the National Party, which is the easiest thing to do. I was donating to my local parties instead because I didn't think the national campaign was up to much. So I just tried to help out in my own area. It was completely fruitless, by the way, completely. But, so some people will still donate to the party. They're not expecting anything in return. But, they may just look at it and go, well, your campaign's crap. So what? I'm just wasting my money by giving it to you. Then you've got the ones who want something back. And it doesn't matter what it is. We don't have to categorize that. They want something back. They see it as a return. In other words, the donation, it's more of an investment. They only see it as useful if you're in government. And they may not be after anything nefarious. They may just like the policy. They may just think that the policies financially benefit them. So they will donate to making it happen. It doesn't have to be a dodgy deal. It could just be, well, your policy on this will help my business, so I will donate. But again, if you don't think they're going to win, then it's not an investment. It's a waste of money, so it dried up, basically. Anyway. M say, I like to think I have a brain more geared to creative subjects than strictly analytical stuff. Well, it can be both. But some people are more one than the other. Should compare the size of the UK economy relative to Germany before and after the referendum and now. Well, for something like that, you'd want to do per capita, wouldn't you? Because Germany is a larger country. The only country you'd really get away with just doing a straightforward comparison, I suppose, would be France. It's very similar in terms of population size. Germany is significantly larger. So you'd do a GDP per capita. But that's another thing anyway. I mean, we should be doing GDP per capita anyway. If that's what was posted in the news, if they talked about GDP per capita growth, not GDP, governments would have to behave very differently, wouldn't they? And it's really not. Louise saying there, good evening, Phil. Sorry I'm late. I'm not a teacher anymore. It's fine. You pop up whenever you like. I'm not sat at the front going, you seem to be holding everyone up here. What's your excuse? No, don't waste my time now. Sit down and tell me later. No, I don't. I don't do that anymore. I'm not. I don't do that anymore. Um. Anyway. Um. But there we sit. We should see GDP pre and post Brexit, the full horror. So in terms of the single market stuff like that, well, it is very messy. COVID did make an awful mess of things, and then you've got. So I mean, in this country, what have we had? We had COVID, massively disruptive to the economy, as it was around the world. There's no denying that. Then in 2021, we left the single market and customs union, but we still had COVID problems that were still ongoing. The vaccination program effectively was running through 2021. So you still had not only some travel restrictions around the world, because it doesn't, it's not just what's going on in your own country, it's around the world when you're talking about trade, but lots of workers still becoming ill, so productivity still being hit. I mean, we're still getting people ill now, far too many, and too many with long-term illnesses. But everyone seems to have just forgotten about COVID now, everywhere. But and then 2022, then quite early on there, we did have the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So there's been all sorts of things to muddy the waters, and yet, which does make it really tricky to pick apart the impacts on various things. But again, this is why I would say this is a very fair one to go with, because it takes it from a point where the Conservatives had a majority, and COVID and the war of Ukraine in Ukraine, was a common factor for all of these countries. And if you're going to say, well, it hits countries in Europe more severely than elsewhere, well, it's like, well, in some ways, yes. You've also got France and Italy in there, as well as the Eurozone in general, because they love using figures of the Eurozone. Because that's the other thing they do. Or when I put this up, hold on, let's go back to this. And I've said about how they'll pick out when it's really high for the UK and then just not talk about it any other time. They can do the opposite. They can try and find a time when it's really low for the Eurozone and then go on about that as well. So, or just when it's lower than the UK. That's what they do. They just, they're not consistently looking at, and you shouldn't anyway. And you shouldn't just take these snapshots with anything to do with statistics. You should look at trends over time. But there we go. In a democracy, it's people who should fund a democracy. So, well, yes, in terms of like funding of political parties and politicians, absolutely. A lot of what we see is a good shout for we shouldn't really have large donations. You can understand a certain level of donation, because how does a political party become established? You can't just sort of say, right, there's no more funding allowed at all in politics, but you must severely limit it, like a tenner or something, maybe a bit more. But you have to get rid of these large donations and publicly fund according to electoral success. Share of the vote and thing, which includes local elections as well. I'm not saying just the big ones, but you get an amount of funding. For local elections, you get an amount of funding according to your share of the vote in previous elections, and and so on. Just get a share of the money according to your current established success, and then you can still top it up with small. You can have memberships to political parties, which effectively counts as a donation up to a certain amount. None of this, we'll just charge £1 million membership. So, there'll have to be caps, obviously. There'll have to be caps on personal donations. And there will have to be a lot of scrutiny on where those donations come from. Tight controls to make sure you don't have someone just donating like £5 500,000 times or something. So otherwise that would happen. Punay's saying, I think the earliest we could get a rejoin referendum 2032-33 as part of an election promise. Do I think it could be done sooner, or am I too optimistic? Do you know what? The problem is every time, the more I look at it, the more it just looks further away. It's really depressing because, and I said this, I've made this point before on the channel quite recently, and when you look at experts on EU policy, people who are experts on EU policy, and I mean UK-based ones as well, because you could imagine some EU-based ones are sort of playing for their team and then maybe just like, mecking out that, oh no, they're not really going to go for anything as a negotiating position. But when you've got people like Sam Lowe and Chris Gray and David Hennig, UK-based experts on EU policy, and they're saying things like, yeah, it's going to be really slow. It's going to be really slow. David Hennig recently was pointing out, so one of the things that Labour want is a veterinary agreement, because, we're a long way off politically, even in this country, being ready to say, yes, we should have a referendum. And I know lots of people will say, oh, but there's a majority want to. It's like, well, two things. First of all, no, there's not. When you look at those polls that say a majority would like to rejoin the EU, they're not being given any conditions. It's been like as if we could just flick a switch and do it. Whereas you do get polling that says, oh, would you want to rejoin the EU if we had to give up the pound? At which point, all of a sudden, it's not a majority anymore. And then the other thing is majority opinion counts for nothing in first past the post anyway, which is why we need electoral reform. But, the more you sort of listen to these, David Hennig was, so Labour want this veterinary agreement, and which would be brilliant. I mean, when just even a month ago, I was thinking this is brilliant. Maybe by the end of the Parliament, we could actually start to remove some of these trade barriers. I knew it wouldn't happen overnight. I knew, but I was thinking maybe before the next election, we could start to strip away some of these trade barriers. And then David Hennig comes out and goes, yeah, took Switzerland 15 years. 15 years. And, to basically remove their trade barriers. Because so Switzerland, for those, is not in the EU. It has access to the single market. It's a very complex arrangement because it's lots of bespoke deals. And yeah, 50. And I'm thinking, and even though he's not suggesting it would take 15 years to implement a veterinary agreement with the EU, to agree and implement a veterinary agreement with the EU, it's maybe a suggestion these things are not quick. And we have this unfortunate position at the moment where we want it to be quick. And it's not us slowing it down, but anyway. But there we are. Don't chuck the board rubber at Louise. I never chucked board rubbers. Don't throw things, so it's naughty. I had a maths teacher who used to throw board rubbers. Not at me, but they did sometimes hit me, because in that particular class, I was sat next to someone who was quite naughty and she wasn't a very good shot. Most of the time it was chalk, I have to say. But occasionally it was a board rubber, which we weren't supposed to do even then. But it's completely out of order now. We don't have violence in classrooms. But anyway, where was it? Where was it? Comments. So that's what I would say on that. I mean, in terms of but we've got so many stages to go through first anyway. The important thing really is that from our point of view in the UK, we move as positively in the right direction as we can. And part of that is pressure on the government, but in the right areas. And part of it is actually getting that conversation going with everyone else, because we need people to understand just how damaging being outside the single market. But there's so much emphasis on the single market and none at all the customs union. It's costing us a fortune being outside the customs union, and for no real benefit. One angry pagan there. Given the unpopular decisions made so far by Rachel Reeves, winter fuel payment, PFI house building. I don't think it's really PFI house building, but I'll take your meaning anyway. And departmental cuts. I don't think we're talking departmental cuts either, although again, I know that's how it's been reported. How do I think she'll turn things around? So what's going to happen first of all is Labour have announced funding increases for a lot of things. So when they talk about the cuts, what they're saying is cutting things to pay for the... So overall, there'll be more spending. It's really this simple. If you think about the mathematics of it, in terms of public... So when you talk about austerity, usually austerity as your starting point, because that's what we've had basically a lot of years of. Austerity is where you shrink public funding, public spending, however you want to call it. So the opposite of austerity is where you increase it. Now, in order to increase it, you have to, in order to increase it net, that is, you have to either increase your tax revenues, and there's two ways to do that. You can either raise the overall level of tax, or you can sit around and wait for some growth to naturally give you more taxes above the rate of inflation. Or you can borrow, or you can do some combination of the three. So if you think about what Rachel Reeves is foreshadowing ahead of this budget. So first of all, in the manifesto itself, when the Tories said, oh, they said they wouldn't put up taxes, like, no, the manifesto says they will put up taxes. You've been bellyaching about some of them. They're going to, for example, charge VAT on private school fees. That's not going to come into effect until like next January or something, but that is coming. We're going to have a windfall tax applied more robustly to oil and gas companies, but also that rate is going to go up as well. So it's going to be applied more robustly and the rate is going to go up. We know that they're going to have, they're going to hire more tax inspectors, which should then chase down more tax evasion. They're also going to change some rules to cut out certain tax avoidance schemes. And now Rachel Reeves is talking about the need to look at other forms of taxation. We are expecting, for example, capital gains tax to go up, maybe even be equalised with income tax. That is sort of being baked in. So what we are being told is that the rate of tax is effectively going up. It's just not the taxes that are going to hit ordinary people, we hope. She hasn't announced the full details yet. Because they did promise not to raise them for ordinary working people. So, for example, if they tried to put fuel duty up, that I think would be a break of promise, right? But we know that the rate of tax is going up. They're not cutting any taxes, but they are raising some. So the overall tax revenues will go up as a result of that. So if the overall tax revenues go up, then the overall spending must be going up, mustn't it? So that's what I say to people who are a bit worried about, oh, because of these cuts, isn't that like austerity? She's not asking them to cut their overall departmental spending. She's asking ministers to come up with ways of making cuts in order to be able to afford the spending in other areas in those departments that they'd already promised. And they'll be getting more funding because they're going to raise taxes more than they'd promised to in the manifesto. So it'll be an overall increase in public spending. Or it should be, because otherwise it makes no sense, does it? Why would you raise taxes and not spend more? That doesn't make sense. Louise saying I got expelled, so I was used to it. Oh. Have I ever thought about putting my politics in a book? Well, I'm not really a writer. And the problem is, if I tried that, and it takes actual writers who know what they're doing quite a while to write books. It's taken Boris Johnson so far 8 years. He was supposed to have written a book in 2016. It's just reminded me, The Guardian just written another article going, what happened to this book he was supposed to have written in 2016? And what happened to his gig on GB News? That he was their star signing last year. He hasn't done a show yet. And I thought, yeah. But even people who are used to writing books, it can take them a while. And I'm not. I've never written a book. And because what I write about is like, or what I would write about is very here and now, it'd almost be like it takes so long that it'd be out of date. Everything's out of date. If you write a political book, like if you write a history, like if you want to write a political history of the Conservative government, so people could do that now in the next few years, from 2010 to 2024, no problem. But if you're trying to write it on something that's happening really now, it'll be out of date before it goes into print. But anyway, Czechs had 10 years of stagnation. They had a revolution. UK have had 18 years of it. So it's, at the moment, it's about 16 years of it since the banking crisis. This will hit your pensions, savings, standard of living, 1848, etc. I mean, well, people have again, this is what people need to be made aware of when they people have to understand the consequence of their actions. Like, immigration is the classic one. If you want less immigration, what you're saying is you want a smaller NHS, so you want to travel further and have a longer queue for treatment. You want to have a smaller economy, so that means, just what it means, less money for public service, for spending on public services, which means you'll either pay a higher rate of tax to get the same public services, or you'll do without the public services. If you want trade barriers, if you're Brexit supporters, you just like the trade barriers, the sovereignty, okay, you will get used to less choice. Because that's the thing, we're still in this sort of period where we're trying to behave as if we can get like, when I was young, like, I could talk about Danish blue a lot, and Danish blue is my favourite cheese. So it's now it's not as guaranteed now, but mostly I can go to a supermarket and get Danish blue. Every now and then they've sold out. That never happened before Brexit. But when I was young, you didn't get it. You got it at Christmas time. So there'd be certain types of food, before the single market existed, even like we had the common market, but that wasn't as sophisticated. There were certain foods you just didn't get other than at Christmas. They were special Christmas foods you got in. And quite a lot of those foods, after, when the single market formed, was so easy to get in that if we had a taste for them all the year round, there are still actual Christmas foods we import in, but for things that aren't specific to Christmas, if you can import them all the year round, we do so. And Danish blue was one of them. So that's one of the benefits of the single market. I got to have Danish blue whenever I liked, which was actually not a great thing in hindsight, because it's not very good for you if you eat it too much. But people need to be told these are the decisions you're making. If you want trade barriers, if you want this sovereignty, that means less choice. We are going to have less choice. At the moment, our trade borders cannot cope. If we try to apply proper standards and customs controls, we slow down trade to a crawl, so you've got empty shelves. But if we don't apply them, then we look weak. We don't have a strong negotiating position with the EU, and we run the risk. Well, we're letting smugglers have a riot. It's probably an unfortunate word to use at the moment. And we run the risk of, importing a very dangerous animal disease that could wipe out a good section of our farming. So, how do you deal with that? It's like a dilemma. It's like you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. A catch-22. But no, what we're going to have to do is get used to the fact that we're going to have less choice, less food, fewer medicines. That's the choice we've made, and people need to be told that's the choice you've made. And again, that's what I would do in terms of, trying to harden people's position against Brexit. Tell them the consequence of this is that you're going to have to get used to less choice. We ended up with more choice when the single market was formed. That was a result of trade barriers breaking down. Now we've put those trade barriers back up. So we're going to have to get used to less choice, and not just less choice, but also less quantity of some things. But there we go. You say they have to raise taxes with no spending to pay for the Conservative National Insurance Corps. So there is an extent to which it is true to say that the Conservative budget earlier this year was predicated on unspecified cuts to public spending. So that is true. However, there are very specific spending increases in the Labour manifesto. So there are spending. I mean, we've already seen some of them, haven't we? The public sector pay awards. So and there's been other funding as well. There's been more funding going in for GPs. I know some public sector areas are still complaining there's not enough funding, but there has been extra funding already promised, particularly around healthcare and public services in general. So, and we obviously know the moves towards net zero. Labour had the option of saying, and they had an easy option of, for example, saying, well, we'll just have to scale them back a bit or delay. And they've said, no, we're going full steam ahead on this. although full steam ahead is also not a great analogy to use there. But there you go. M saying, doesn't necessarily take ages to write a book. It depends on the type of writer you are. Yeah, I suppose I could just make it up and just write a load of crap. But I'm not a writer. So I would think if there is a writer who is capable of knocking them out quite quickly, it's probably an experienced writer. I am not a Barbara Cartland of any genre of writing. Louise saying, since Brexit has been huge problems getting my medication, huge problems. There will be, because there are always going to be problems with any supply chain. And before we left the single market, we had, there were shortages of medicines then, for NHS medicines then. We would have typically a shortage at any one time in the country of about 20 different drugs. Now it's about 160, 180. So the sheer number of drugs that at any one time we have a shortage of in this country has increased by 8, 9, maybe 10 times before we're done. SFAT saying, why after my favourite cheese is Danish Blue, my mind instantly goes to Wallace from Wallace and Gromit. I don't know why, because theirs seem to be Wensleydale. I do like Wensleydale as well. In fact, I actually neglected to get some Wensleydale this Yorkshire day. I was very disappointed with myself. But there it was. You can't have it all the time. M saying, I'm a writer myself. Could spin out a full-length Gothic novel inside a month. I wrote a lot. I haven't had no training at all. But there we go. I mean, going back to the medicines thing, though, as soon as we talk about Brexit now, one of the most heartbreaking things about Brexit for me was, and this was some years ago now, it was before we left, and the news, there's this news thing where they were talking to various Leave voters, and one of them, I think, was already regretting it, and it was this mother of a young child who had like real serious medical problems, and she said that what sold it for her was the more money for the NHS. So she thought she was doing the best for her child because she believed that the NHS would get more money and that would be better for my child who's got these serious medical problems. At the time, even in 2016, the NHS was struggling again because it was 5 or 6 years after the Tories had come in, and obviously austerity had taken its toll. It was still better than it is now, but it was bad then. And I just thought to myself when I watched this thing on the news, you've actually voted to potentially hurt your child. But she obviously didn't know that. She did the opposite. And that's one of the real cruelties of Brexit. And this is why it's the closest thing to unforgivable, Brexit, because the people behind it knew it was lies. And they knew that they were getting people to vote against their interests. And I often sometimes think about that mother and what she must think now. Because, she voted, she thought, to improve the health care of her child. And what she actually did was voted to worsen it. And that is one of that is the nasty side to Brexit. It's why I describe the Conservative Party as a fundamentally different. I mean, you'd put Reform UK into that bracket now, UKIP at the time. But the Conservatives of all the sort of major parties that have been major parties for many years are fundamentally different to other political parties in that they don't just have different ideas. They are fundamentally dishonest, and they deliberately persuade people to vote against their interests. And that is why you end up with things like this. Tim Montgomery, he's not a stupid man, because you could look at someone saying that as a result of that headline and think he's either stupid or dishonest, and you don't necessarily know what it is, but he's not a stupid man. So he knows he's lying. He knows he's lying. It's, as I say, it's one thing to try and persuade other people that your party should be. So in my case, for example, okay, I believe the Labour Party are the best party of government, certainly in terms of the available options. So yes, you could argue it's in my interest to emphasise the benefits of a Labour government and to particularly shine a spotlight on the failures of a Conservative government. And he's just doing the same thing. The party's the other way around. But he's lying. It's one thing to shine a spotlight on the good things about your party and the bad things about the opposing party. It's another to make them up completely. And that is why I say the Conservative Party, and I'm not saying you don't get people like this on the left either. Of course you do. You get grifters and liars on the left. Of course you do. But in terms of parties, there's something fundamentally different about the Conservative Party. Pullinator saying, voted to hurt your child sounds like my dad. He voted to leave, and that, along with other reasons, completely cut him out. Yeah, we've had this. But I mean, that was, again, that is unforeseen. It's not the intention, and that is what's cruel about it. And that is why Brexit is you know, from a cruel party, a cruel policy. Because they knew full well that it wasn't. They knew that the Brexit that would emerge in reality was absolutely not the will of the people at any time. They knew that, and they did it anyway. Are Labour going to scrap the India trade deal? Haven't heard anything. No, they're still trying to get one. Oh no, they're still trying to get one. I mean, at the end of the day, if you need trade deals, and if you so even if they only improve things a little bit, but obviously now that we are going to insist, now that we've got a government that's going to prioritise a trade deal that's going to do us some good, even if it's not brilliant, over one just to get Daily Express positive headlines, inevitably these things may be now tricky. But no, Labour are absolutely, well, they're giving the impression that they want an India trade deal. Obviously, I suppose we don't know behind the scenes what they really want. They may be just giving the impression that they do, but privately acknowledging that realistically we're probably not going to agree terms. Who knows? Because apart from anything else, we know what India prizes. It wants those. So what India wants is it wants Indian students in the UK who come to the UK to study at university. It wants them to have an automatic right to an extended work visa after they graduate so that they can work in the UK for a bit, you know, learn about how, you know, how it works from this side of the business. And then, so the idea is they would then go back to India, taking those skills with them, which they can then, you know, share with the equivalent business back in India. Because India, I mean, we were talking about this with Mark Galsworthy in the video last week. In most countries understand the benefits of having your own citizens move around the world, move around different places, learn skills, bring them back. It's useful. So that's what India wants. It wants those automatic postgraduate visas for working. Now, obviously, anything that is going to effectively allow a level of uncontrolled immigration, as it would be described, is politically tricky. So whether Labour are serious about an India trade deal, I don't know. But publicly, they are certainly meeting with officials in India and politicians in India. I think David Lammy went over there, didn't he? And, you know, so they are looking like they're pushing it, but it may or may not be real. Brad saying there, Farage's high earnings highlight the hypocrisy of his supporters. Literally anyone else earning as much will be scolded as liberal elite. Well, I mean, I don't focus on the amount. A lot of people have done. The way I look at it is you've got people on the right moaning about how much Gary Lineker is paid, and then you've got people on the left moaning about how much Nigel Farage is paid. For me, it's not about that. It's about the fact he's supposed to be an MP, so that's supposed to be his job. And he's not committing, he's not doing anything for the job. We've had people saying from Clacton, you know, he hasn't been responding to emails or anything like that. They can't get in touch with him to deal with constituency matters. They're not trying to get in touch with him to have a moan about his immigration stance or anything. They've got constituency matters to deal with. They effectively don't have an MP. They don't have an MP. And So for me, that's the issue, that he's getting paid almost his entire income for a completely different job, for which there are significant time commitments. It's not like he's getting like 12, 13 or 1.2, 1.3 million quid a year just for like doing a Christmas show or something, which has no real time requirement when you consider the overall year. He's getting it for what is a significant outlay of time. I think I worked it out at least 16 hours a week that he has, and that's just for the main three things he does: the video recordings, and those were estimates. They said it could be more in some weeks, but the video recordings, the personal messages, the Daily Telegraph writing, and the GB News presenting. You know, by his own estimates, added up to about 16 hours a week, and that is a significant outlay of time. That's like 2 working days, basically, isn't it? So it's not giving him much time to do anything else, and he's not spending any time doing any of his parliamentary. Or he sometimes goes into Parliament to then moan, you know, ask a question or something stupid. He doesn't ask many questions, though, has he? But anyway, Farage, sorry, we've still done that one. Will Labour pull back on the net zero deadlines? They're going to be very unpopular the closer we get to 2030. Well, at the moment, they insist not. That's what I mean. They had the option, because first of all, the Conservatives had already sort of changed that deadline, and they sort of said, well, the EU have put it back anyway, so we could just be in alignment with the EU. So politically, they had the option, and they went, no, we're going to be ready for 2030. So we will see. I'm going to... it's one of these things now where you look at it and you think, okay, well, if they put it back in a couple of years' time, sure, they could say, well, we really tried for it, we really went for it, we're committed to it, but the Tories had just caused too much damage. The problem then is you've got a real tough fight for the narrative, because it could be billed as you were incompetent, or you didn't understand what was involved, or something like that. So it can backfire on you. So given that Labour have committed to it, I'm going to guess they've thought about all these things, because it's not impossible to have to put it back. Others, again, they don't necessarily have to put it back by 5 years. Let's say they're going to miss it out by 1 year. Well, 1 year is not terrible. Particularly if the target is still 2030 and they have the election in 2028. So going to the next election, they could still insist that the target is 2030, because it's still got like a couple of years. So we'll see. But I would think, given that they've recommitted to 2030, it's very risky to then delay after that. They might get away with the delay of 1 year, but not going for the 5 years. That would make them look like they hadn't considered things, or they didn't know what they were doing. Has Farage put his money into Coots? Well, the money we know about, I suspect, yes. What about the money we don't know about? Because again, if you look at... See, Nigel, even though I used Nigel... I said in that video, I used Nigel Farage's... because he was being billed as the highest paid member, but also because his... the way he'd set it out was actually quite good. It was nice and clear and everything. It had lots of different categories in it. So let me just... I'm just going to put up a couple of things. Hold on. Let's put it up on the screen. Where are we? So let's just do a little grab. So there's the Nigel Farage one. So, you know, it's all set out. So you've got employment and earnings. You've got your gifts, benefits, hospitality. So you'll notice these are numbers. There's one. There's no number 2 here. We can look at number 2 in a minute. Visits outside the UK, 6, blah, 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 blah. So, you know, he's got several categories in there. He's laid it out well enough in terms of what he needs to do. But if I were to go to his mate, and I mentioned this in my video today, Richard Tice. Where is he? Ticey boy. There we go. If I do the same thing for him, so employment and earnings, £10,500 a quarter. He says it's variable depending on rent roll. So he reckons from this property investment, he's getting £10,500 a quarter. No. Richard Tice has been donating £1.4 million a year to Reform UK. Well, not donating, sorry, lending. But he's got the money to lend. That's not his earning. He's not earning like 40 grand a year. He's loaded. He's raking it in. Why is that the only income he's got there? Because it's registered in this country. The rest of his earnings are registered offshore, so you don't touch them. So there's lots of earnings in here. So Nigel Farage, he's not. And in fact, let's look at another one, an even more obvious one. Who's the richest MP in Parliament? Who is the richest MP in Parliament? It's a Mr. Sunak, isn't it? And I'm not even including his wife's wealth here. Too many people do that. And although you shouldn't ignore his wife's investments because it's family investment still, his own wealth is greater than any MP. He hasn't even got that category there. Look. Number one, employment and earnings. Number one, employment and earnings. Rishi Sunak straight on to number two. No employment, because, well, you know, you don't count MP salary or anything related to Parliament, of course. This is additional. But no earnings at all. None from a private business or anything like that for Mr. Sunak. You're not going to tell me that Mr. Sunak doesn't have investments that have earned him money. Of course he does. He just doesn't have to declare them because... Why? Why? I don't know, but I'm going to guess because it's offshore. Because there's nothing there. There's nothing in there at all. So according to Rishi Sunak, he had no earnings last year apart from his prime ministerial salary. Do not believe that for a second. I mean, again, if we keep picking on people that we know, and I know these are all Tories, but they're the ones we know have business interests. There may be other ones who've earned as well on the Labour benches, but I don't necessarily know who they are. I'm looking for the former Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, because he's registered, for example, he's a portfolio of shares held in a blind trust, but notice we don't know how much because he's got none either. Nothing mentioned. No income. Even though, if we read down on here, we know he owns 7 properties which he rents. Rental income. What is it? Don't know. That's income though. It's not registered. Why are these things not registered? Anyway, I'll get rid of that because I could go on for that for ages, couldn't I? Punator, how long do I think it'll be before the Tories notice the massive issue they have with demographic shifts in the voting public? They should know now. Any Tory MP or strategist or anyone connected to the party that does not know, it's even been written about in their own media. So they should know about it now. I suppose what they're trying to do is think to themselves, well, there's nothing we can do about that because we knackered the NHS. So there's nothing we can do about that. But their job is really, they have to attract a lot of new voters. Or, now when I say new voters, I mean compared to this year. So there may, and there were actually, there'll have been a lot of Conservative voters who just stayed at home. So when I say new voters, I'm also including the people who will have voted in, I don't mean brand new voters, people who will have voted in the past, and they need to get them back. However, that is not enough. If all of the people that voted Conservative the last few elections, say, who just stayed at home, if the Conservatives win all of those people back at the next election, that is not enough for them. So they will also recognise they can't stop old age. So although they should be aware of that big hit, that demographic hit that's coming their way, there's nothing they can do about it. Not a thing. In theory, the government can do something. I don't just mean with better healthcare, but in terms of sort of like shifting position. So if, for example, like, let's say the Tories were still in power, right? And they knew certain key marginals are going to suffer from this demographic loss. They could try and encourage an influx of their voters in there with like housing and some special deal to get attract the sort of people who are more likely to vote Conservative. In theory, you could do that. But they're out of power, so there's nothing they can do to game the system now. So all they can try and do is to appeal to people who did not vote for them in 2024 to do so in 2028, 2029. It's a tough ask. It is a tough ask. I mean, I'm not... It's the more I think about it, the more sort of I run the risk of becoming complacent about the next election. But it's... Although you can... And you can look at it from both sides. You can look at Labour's position. You can go... But it was... You know, we talk about this efficiency of the vote, and they won lots of seats by a very small margin all through the last 4 years. That's what I kept saying. That's how you win elections. That's what the Tories did in 2019. They won a lot of seats by small margins. Well, this time round, Labour won way more seats by even smaller margins. So their coalition of voters is wafer thin. At the same time, we also know from surveys and so on, there were a lot of people stayed at home that wanted the Tories out. They were just satisfied that they didn't need to go out and vote for. They're not enthused by Labour. So again, as long as Labour get things right at the next election, Labour actually have more capacity to increase the number of voters voting for them at the next election than the Tories do, is what I'm saying. So, you know, you could look at Labour's position thinking it's quite weak, they don't want to cock it up. But you can look at the Tories' position and say, but how are they, you know, how are they going to come back? Because people tend not to vote out a government that's doing all right. It's like better the devil you know. They'll remember that the Tories were terrible. The best the Tories can hope to do is persuade them that their new look front bench is different. The problem is they're planning on basically still shuffling the same chairs around, aren't they? You know, who's going to win the leadership contest? Probably Robert Jenrick or Kemi Badenoch. There's a couple of other possibles. Tom Tugendhat and Priti Patel can't rule out. I really don't think James Cleverly, and definitely not Mel Stride. But whoever it is so. All of the current contenders have been in cabinet in the last parliament, in the last government. So it's not a new face that's going to be leading them, which is fine. But then what's the front bench? What's their shadow cabinet going to look like? Is that going to be new look? If not, it's the same people. So you're already going to have a tough time persuading voters that you are new, that you're different to the ones who destroyed everything. But at the same time, so you have that wariness on the part of voters going, well, you sort of seem quite similar, you've just changed chairs. And at the same time, as long as Labour deliver noticeable improvements, and that is an if, you know, but that's for Labour to do, then it's really hard to see how the Tories do come back quickly at all. But there it is anyway. I'll catch up with the last couple of comments because we've gone over time now. Ivan Ambrose there saying the whole system of registering financial interest needs a total overhaul to bring genuine transparency. Yes, we must have full transparency. We should see all of their financial interest, not just in this country, everywhere, because the nature of MPs' work, and especially when they're in government, but MPs in general, being able to lobby ministers, even if they're not ministers, the decisions they make, the policy decisions they make, can also impact international investments. So it doesn't matter where your money is pugged away. You know, we should know everything. And if someone doesn't like that level of scrutiny, don't be an MP. No one's forcing you to be an MP. We need to get out of this mindset of letting politicians get... Politicians should be held to higher standards than everyone else, not lower. Not at all lower. But there we go. Looked at Starmer's register of interest, visited many football matches. Yeah, likes his football, which explains his priority for a football regulator. Possibly. That it may well be it. Who knows? But there we go anyway. We'll call it there. Thanks very much for calling out, everyone. Have a great evening. I'm pleased to report that it seems to be a bit cooler now. I almost thought about putting a jumper on earlier, in fact. Hopefully summer is over. But yes, until next time, I'll see you later.